And I think this time around, there will be stark choices to be made. We've had a government which has been, according to most, very surprisingly restrained in terms of expenditure in a crisis year. Now, going into next year, I'm not sure what you think is an appropriate approach. I think others have said that you have to keep the expenditure to GDP at least at the levels of FY21, if not increase it, while reducing the fiscal deficit using things like asset sales, etc. But you're convinced that you do need a significant fiscal push in an economy like the one that we're living in?
Absolutely. I think that's definitely a given. I also want to suggest that one of the things that was done very well, I think, 3 years ago with the NK Singh committee report was the move away from thinking of government finances in the very, very short term. The idea that you should be more or less balancing things year on year. I feel like we've regressed a little bit from that when we say that we have to keep the fiscal deficit under control by, say, asset sales and so on. In fact, if we really believe the multipliers, which, for example, the RBI puts out, and there've been estimates thereof, actually increasing expenditure, especially in a moment when there's no inflation right now, is not likely to actually raise debt to GDP ratios that much, especially if you have a more bang for the buck with things like capital expenditure and so on. So I think that we really ought to be thinking in at least a 3 to 5 year time frame, and not currently worry about this year's shortfall in terms of a fiscal deficit or a primary deficit.
That graphic on the screen, Arjun, is sort of a model that one of your colleagues has put together. You want to talk us through what it's suggesting, that perhaps we can go ahead with the right kind of expenditure while maintaining our trajectory on a lowering debt to GDP eventually?
Sure. This is work that's just going to be released soon by our colleague Ziko Dasgupta. And he was asking a very simple question. He says, look, suppose we are forced and we really do want to increase revenue expenditure, right? Continuing expenditure, not capital expenditure, by a certain amount, let's say 3 lakh crores, right? A certain amount that we want to increase it by. Can we do a judicious mix of, say, capital and non-capital expenditure, which have different multipliers that are associated with them, and still keep our central debt to GDP ratio roughly constant, 55% of GDP? And that's the thought experiment that he undertook. And he looked through the data and he said, look, actually you can. All right. So why is that the case? Because actually capital expenditure to GDP ratio has a high multiplier, and non-capital primary expenditure to GDP ratio, while it doesn't have that high a multiplier, is not a zero multiplier either, or a negative multiplier. So that in fact there will be a kick to the economy. So these are his estimates, which suggest the brown bars are just saying how much we can expand and in what proportion to each one of say capital expenditure, non-capital expenditure, and still roughly remain at 55% debt to GDP at the center. So the basic thing that seems very clear from this is, if you look at the last graph, primary expenditure to GDP ratio can go up by about around 3 percentage points of GDP, and we would still not actually see a very large increase in the debt to GDP ratio. So there is a lot more space than people are making out.